understand the wider war, because the soldiers really didn't think about it in those terms. They were very, very focused on what was happening in their, essentially in their sector.
I imagine you guys were too. I don't imagine there was a lot of thinking about, gosh, what are the politics about this as you're sort of being shelled 4 or 5 times a day?
You're right, but I mean, also that we hope the film has 2 purposes. I mean, on the one hand, it kind of reveals the kind of nature of men in war and what war is about. And you know, people have asked me like, why is this film relevant to Human Rights on a Film Festival? And I think that the film, you know, the more war impacts on human rights. So the more information we have about war and how it's actually conducted, that will help us understand a little bit more about how it impacts on human rights. But at the same time, although the film, we kind of wanted to make an apolitical film, I hope the film does, and we hope the film does focus people's minds on the war at hand in Afghanistan at this very critical time.
I would hope so. How did you get hooked up with the company?
I was placed there kind of randomly by the Public Affairs Office in Bagram Air Base. There's an embed system, an embed program. If you're an accredited journalist, you file your papers with them, and they place you in frontline units. And so I was, I think, pretty randomly put with Battle Company. You know, I had grown up in the wake of Vietnam. I did not have a particularly, I didn't know anyone in the U.S. military. I didn't have a particularly positive view of it. And the guys that I met in Battle Company, the officers and the men, I was just really impressed by. And I thought if they go back to Iraq, I really didn't want to cover Iraq. I thought it was a massive mistake, strategic mistake by the U.S. And essentially based on a lie. And I didn't want to, you know, risk getting killed covering a lie, basically. But, you know, Afghanistan for me was a different matter. I've been going there since 1996. I knew the level of suffering in Afghanistan in the 90s. I saw the incredible hope that the Afghans had when NATO came in 2001, and it became an important story to me. So I thought if Battle Company goes back to Afghanistan, I want to follow one platoon for a whole deployment. And then Tim and I hooked up, and that was the result is this film.
You obviously got very intimate with these troops, going back several times, obviously, and I would imagine that you won over their respect just for being so dogged and sticking with this. Was there anything that you guys had filmed that you felt was too intimate, that you couldn't include it, or that you felt might misrepresent what's going on over there, or what these soldiers are going through?
I don't think there was really much that we felt that we filmed that we didn't want to put in the film because it misrepresented. I mean, I think that in the film you see a wide variety of things. I mean, in terms of things where the soldiers look, you know, it makes them look strong and whatever it is, nice people, and on the side there's bits where you're like, oh, they don't look so good there. I mean, right. We're pretty even-handed, I think, in what we filmed and what we showed. I mean, I did film like more. I mean, there's more gratuitous violence, you know, images of you know, of more graphic nature of people dead, both of American soldiers and of the Afghan civilians who were killed. And I just felt that, you know, that was the only bit where I censored putting stuff in because I felt that it would be a Pyrrhic victory to kind of prove to censors that I was censoring myself. I was not censoring myself. I mean, I don't think you need to see people with their heads blown off, and I think you get a sense of the emotional journey of what it's like to be in that situation. And I just don't think that was necessary.
Sebastian, I know you've said in past interviews that there were points, like after you were in the Humvee that was attacked and there were bullets flying by you, hitting sandbags inches from your head, that there was a moment where you felt like, yeah, I kind of want to pick up a gun. I kind of want to let these people know that this is not acceptable what they're doing right now. I don't like my life being in danger. Which begs the question, I guess, how objective can you be when you're embedded like this and being fired upon and really kind of facing the enemy one-on-one?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're referring to a section of my book where we got blown up and by a guy who was, you know, 100 feet away with some wire, you know, touched 2 wires to a battery and blew us up. And I was just sort of examining my feelings later, and I asked myself the question, if you'd had the, I mean, he could have killed all of us. I mean, it was a chance, it was lucky he didn't. And, you know, it was a matter of half a second or so, and I asked myself the very difficult question, if I could have saved us all by killing him somehow, magically, would I do it? And the answer was yes, you know. And that became a very troubling thought to have in my mind, and I really tried to understand it. How objective can you be in journalism? Not at all. I don't think you can be objective at all. I mean, I think I was in Sarajevo in the 90s, you know, when the civilian population, you know, this was in the middle of a genocide, ethnic cleansing that killed, I think, 250,000 civilians. wasn't at all objective about that. You know, my opinion of the Serb military, what they were doing in Sarajevo, was very clear in my mind. They were wrong. And so I completely sort of bonded with the people in Sarajevo because I thought that they were the victims in a very complicated war. And so, you know, I think wherever you are, if you embed with the police and cover crime in New York City, you affiliate with the police. If you embed in a high crime neighborhood with the people, you look at the police in a different way. I think it's unavoidable, and it's also unavoidable with the military.
Rachel, given that this is the Human Rights Watch Film Festival, can you give us some insight into what the status of human rights is right now in Afghanistan?
Well, looking at the conflict, civilian casualties are still extremely high and going up. Last year, 2,400 civilians were killed. The vast majority by the insurgency, about 2/3 to 3/4. The US and NATO forces have made some quite strenuous efforts. I think there's been a realization that the civilian casualties was impacting their ability to win a war in Afghanistan so heavily that they have tried to reduce, in particular, the use of airstrikes. But we still see significant numbers of people being killed. About 200 civilians have been killed, probably by what's called pro-government forces, which is predominantly US forces, just between January and May of this year. So they're still very high, and in Afghan eyes, that's it's almost immaterial that they've reduced somewhat. So in terms of civilian casualties, it's still a very troubling situation, and there's great concern that this year the military is pushing into the south, which is very much the Taliban heartlands. And the troops themselves can be something of a magnet for the insurgents. So if they go into somewhere like Kandahar, lots of Kandaharis are already leaving in anticipation of what that means in terms of the Taliban presence there. In terms of the wider human rights picture, it's pretty dismal. There are some signs of improvement, you know, in areas like education, health to some degree. But overall, the state is very weak. It's not really delivering services. As you'll all be aware, there's kind of rampant corruption. And I think there's still a lot of confusion about what the strategy is, whether you've got a willing partner in the Afghan government in order to, you know, realise that strategy, and whether the international, both forces and reconstruction efforts are actually capable of delivering what they want to deliver. Even if there's been a lot of big thinking about what they're actually trying to do, I still have big questions about whether they have the capability to do it. Sorry, I was going into broader political questions, but on human rights terms, I'm busy. Let's just say that.
I've got one last question for the three of you before I open the questions up to the audience. I'm just curious, since you spent a lot of time there, and obviously you have a lot of first-hand knowledge of what's going on, what do you think the biggest misconception the public might have about the Afghanistan war is right now? And short of us going out and making our own documentary and embedding ourselves for 14 months and writing a book about this, what can we, the general public, do to get a broader, more clearer picture of what's going on right now?
Go ahead.
Stump them. Finally stumped them.
Let me give you a little bit of background on my perception of the battle in Korangal, because I think actually the level of debate among politicians and also in our media can be a bit shallow sometimes. I was just saying to these guys, we just had an election in the UK where when the main leaders discussed Afghanistan, all they actually talked about was how many helicopters were being deployed there, not the actual strategy. It's very superficial. Korangal is a very interesting example. These were not really Talibs. I mean, they're very extremist Islamists. They were desperately protecting their timber trade. There were some early blunders, like their spiritual leader was thrown into Guantanamo. Another elder died in suspicious circumstances in detention. There were some Karzai cronies that were being perceived to be given some jobs a bit too close to the Korangal Valley that they thought might threaten their economic interests. There are all these economic, very local factors that drove this valley into an insurgency. And after 5 years of fighting, the last frame said that there was the beginning of withdrawal from Korangal. They've actually gone now. They went in, I think, April. They pulled out entirely. And so there are big questions there, in my view, about why so many US soldiers died in this valley. I mean, we're talking about six miles by half a mile. It's a very small area. Why so many people died for a fight that was essentially local. So I think, I mean, there's a degree of nuance and background and complexity to the conflict that's still often characterised as a good v bad, as pro-government versus anti-government. And actually there's a whole underlying so much of the insurgency. And when we've now got a political strategy that is